This is Amateur Hour, and I'm Ben, the Amateur Exegete. Joining me is my co-host, Mark Edward, of the website BibleDarkly.com. Christian apologists have offered various lines of argumentation, some more dubious than others, to contend for the historicity of the Exodus event as it is recorded in the Torah. One such argument claims that a 2nd millennium BCE papyrus housed in the Brooklyn Museum contains the names of enslaved Hebrews, lending credence to the idea that the Pentateuch has it right, that before their miraculous departure from Egypt, the Israelites were indeed slaves there. But does this hold any water? Our guest today doesn't think so. In March of last year, he wrote a post for my website, amateurexegete.com, which argues that apologists who use the papyrus in this way are doing so on the basis of misunderstanding and misinformation. Going by the pen name Lex Lata, Pat has also written posts at my website dealing with apologetic plagiarism, as well as a review of Ronald Hendel's recent contribution to the Yale Anchor Bible Library. Pat, welcome to Amateur Hour.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you both.
So before we dig into the papyrus in question, what sparked your interest, not only in ancient history, but also biblical studies in general?
Well, I grew up in a relatively religious family and attended interminable church services every Sunday. They were 2-hour-long charismatic church services. I am not a naturally charismatic person, so I tended to sit through those and read the Bible on Sunday mornings, and learned a lot, but had a lot of questions that my dad, to his credit, tried to answer, but was honest when he couldn't. So I've always been interested in religion as a believer, and then not as a believer as well, in large part because I just am fascinated by comparative religion, mythology, the stories that human beings tell themselves and each other, to make sense of the world, to form communities, to justify their actions, and to develop moral norms, and for entertainment purposes as well. There's nothing wrong with that.
No, that's absolutely a big part.
Yeah. It fuels a lot of us who are either formerly religious or I know Mark's website deals with it from an academic perspective, but I know Mark, you've got a similar background, right? You've got a religious background too.
Yeah, grew up Assemblies of God primarily, some vineyards, so on the more Pentecostal charismatic side.
Now let's turn to the papyrus. I'm going to confess at the intro here that my knowledge of and arguably interest in Exodus-related apologetics is not very great. Mainly because I'm a New Testament guy, but even as I was younger, we kind of took for granted the historicity of the Exodus, and arguments either for or against just didn't come into play. But what is the significance of the papyrus that we're going to talk about as it relates to the field of Egyptian history?
Well, so this papyrus, it's the Papyrus Brooklyn 35.1446, and I should mention parenthetically, there are several papyri Brooklyn. So if people go and Google this, you will find different kinds of papyri Brooklyn at the Brooklyn Museum. But we're talking about 35.1446 exclusively today. So when we refer to the papyrus, that's the one we're talking about. And this is a legitimate, actual serious find. It's about a 7-foot-long papyrus. Well, originally it was 7 feet long. Now it's all flakes and flaps. But if you lay it all out, the pieces go where they're supposed to be. It's a 7-foot-long papyrus, composed from roughly the late 1800s into the first half of the 1700s BCE. It's an interesting document in its own right, insofar as it covers a period of change between the 12th dynasty and the 13th dynasty. Most importantly for our purposes, though, and for general linguistic purposes, it contains a list of slave names, about 95 names about a third of which are Semitic, identifiably Semitic. And some of those names resemble names in the Hebrew Bible. So some apologists have hooked on to those names and argued that that's evidence for Hebrews being in Egypt during this time period, during the 1700s, roughly when we would expect to see Hebrews in Egypt, under bondage, laboring, doing hard labor, that kind of thing.
The situation of Exodus chapter 1.
Yes, more or less.
So let me ask you this, though. Again, excuse my ignorance, but is this a very common apologetic for the historicity of the Exodus? Do a lot of apologists appeal to this particular papyrus, or is this more of a fringe movement? And I one reason I ask this is if you look at some of the older scholarship that argues for the Exodus, or at least when I have in the past, I don't recall ever seeing this papyrus mentioned, or at least not mentioned prominently. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I won't pretend to have done an exhaustive study of the apologetics with this particular papyrus. I know it goes back at least 10 or 15 years. The papyrus has been mentioned by David Roll, who's an evangelical apologist, Egyptologist.
Yep.
That's a mouthful there. And so he talked about it in a Patterns of Evidence movie on the historicity of the Exodus, again, 10 or 15 years ago, whenever that came up. Around the same time, Titus Kennedy started writing about the papyrus. As far as I know, he might have written stuff earlier about it.
Yeah.
But I think it's in his book about archaeology and the Bible, and I know it's on his blog, his website.
Yeah.
From about 5 or 10 years ago. I wouldn't say it's a huge element of the sort of pro-Exodus historicity apologetic discourse, but it does come up with some frequency. And the work of folks like Roll and Kennedy, and I expect now, in fact, I know for a fact now, Huff, gets picked up by apologists, lay apologists who don't know any better, because it is on its face, it's actually a pretty convincing argument they make for folks who don't know about Hebrew and who don't know the demographics and the anthropology of the second millennium BCE. So,
which is most people.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you see people like Sean McDowell's had Titus Kennedy on his channel, and they've talked about this. Frank Turek, most recently, a month or two ago, had a video on, I think it was 8. I might have the number wrong. I think it's 8 lines of evidence for the historicity or the presence of Hebrews in Egypt, or historicity of the Exodus, something like that. And he talks about this. I'm pretty sure he got it from Kennedy. So it does get mentioned. I wouldn't call it fringe. I wouldn't say it's front and center, though, on the historicity side for Exodus. I think people look at the Ippur papyrus seems to get a little bit more attention, and that has to do with finding corroborating evidence for the plagues, which is a whole other discussion.
Oh yeah, big. So Mark, have you come across the papyrus being mentioned at all in any of your research?
If I think about it really hard, I think I've seen the word Brooklyn in this context, but it was long enough ago that it's gone over my head.
Yeah.
So it's not prominent enough that it stands out to me.
And I should mention, in an evangelical, but not necessarily apologetic context, I mean, both Kenneth Kitchen and James Hoffmeyer have written about the papyrus in their works.
Yeah, you footnote to that in your blog post too. You mentioned those names specifically, those pretty famous, archaeologists, researchers.
Yeah, but they're also more careful about how far they can carry the information. In the papyrus.
Exactly.
So they don't. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead, Pat. I keep going. If you got more to say, I'd love to hear it, because this is one of those topics where, again, I'm so ignorant of. Your blog post that you guest wrote was so interesting, because I'd never heard of it before. So just keep going.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Kitchens and Hoffmeyer are actually pretty good at going as far as the evidence will carry them in an academic sense, and then just drawing, helpful inferences from there.
Yeah.
But they don't actually describe evidence in terms that are false.
Did you also cite or mention Albright was he one that also used the
Oh.
argument, or mention, or not use the argument, but mention the papyrus, just not in the way some of these apologists are?
Yes, no. In fact, he worked with William Hayes, who is the Egyptologist who published the Papyrus Brooklist. I think his book was in 1955. It's a little hard to get a hold of, but Albright's article, which really focuses on the Semitic names, came out in 1954. He had early access, because he worked with Hayes on the papyrus.
Yeah,
you can actually find Albright's article in JSTOR. It's not too hard to dig up if you've got the right accounts, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But even, and again, Albright, again, certainly a maximalist, favoring traditional notions of, a historical Exodus and Mosaic. Well, not sure how married he was to Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, but if he thought these were Hebrew names, he would have written that in this article. He was pretty clear that these are, West Semitic, Northwest Semitic names that resemble or are etymologically related to names in the Bible.
So before we move on, Mark, because I know we've talked about this before, could you explain, because you did last time we talked, if I remember correctly, you did a really good job of explaining this, but what the difference is between a maximalist and a minimalist when it comes to this topic? Because
oh gosh,
didn't we talk the Exodus like a few months ago, didn't we?
I feel like we did at some point, but I can't remember for the life of me when it happened.
We're just getting old, that's all.
It's ancient history already, man. Exactly. This stuff is hard. This stuff is hard.
So what was the question? Maximalist
just what is a maximalist? What is a minimalist?
In terms of accepting the historicity?
Yeah.
Well, the way I would define it in the present moment is a maximalist is a person who generally approaches the Bible with the assumption that it's accurate in almost every sense. Maybe not literal, but accurate.
Yeah.
And when they read something like Genesis or Exodus or all the way through 2 Kings, they take basically every detail as much as possible as historically accurate. So when it talks about Moses having been set in a basket to drift on the river for however long before he's discovered by, is it Pharaoh's daughter? Or a handmaiden who delivers him to Pharaoh's daughter, that's historically accurate. Even though we have very good reason to suspect that story is actually based on Assyrian propaganda for one of their semi-mythologicalized kings.
Yeah.
They take the primacy of the Exodus story over the Assyrian version. And that's how they approach the plagues. That's how they approach the escape from Egypt across, the Red Sea, Reed Sea, whatever, into the wilderness, and the wandering for 40 years, and the invasion of Canaan. All of that's historical for the maximalists in almost every detail. For the minimalists who do accept that there is a historical backdrop to these stories, they may not accept every detail as accurate or historical, but they go looking into these stories and they think that there is something behind it that did actually happen. So there is some kind of Moses figure who is historical. He may not have been named Moses. He may not have performed these miracles, but the story is based on something this guy did involving the freedom of slaves and this eventual founding of the Israelite people.
Yeah.
That's how I would define it right now.
No, that sounds about right to me. So in what follows, we're going to be talking about some of the claims made by a specific Christian apologist. This is Wesley Huff. He is currently working at a PhD at the Wycliffe College at the University of Toronto. So he's not an amateur like me, but
I want to raise a point on that if I can.
Oh yeah, sure.
I'll try to be quick about this. So recently, Ben and I were just texting, and he said he wanted to find time to write up a response to a recent apologetics video that he had seen on YouTube. I don't normally get involved in that side of things, just because, for the most part, it doesn't interest me. I'm interested in the academic side, the historical side, the nitty gritty technical stuff, as much as I'm able to understand it. But when it gets into the more confessional side of things, that's where I start to lose interest, because I don't want to, partly don't want to upset anybody, but I also just I don't have any dog in that race.
Yeah.
So he sends me this link, and I watch the video. It's about 7 minutes long. I have no idea who this person is. And I'm watching it, and I end up writing my own response to it before Ben can get to it. And only after I finish this and post it, and then maybe a few days later, I just Google the guy's name, I realized this is a very prominent apologist.
Yeah.
And knowing that, like, he's been on Joe Rogan, knowing that he is this professional with such a enormous audience, I was shocked at how sloppy and, to be frank, bad that apologetics video was. That how badly he misrepresented the text that he was talking about.
Yeah.
So I don't know if being a professional apologist really counts for much, if that's the standard of quality.
It seems like a lower bar. Yeah. I don't know if I talked to this about this with you, Pat, but it was a video about the deity of Christ in the Gospel of Mark. And
yeah, we did chat briefly, and Mark, I read your piece and I liked it a lot.
Thank you.
I knew exactly who you were talking about, even though I don't think you mentioned his name.
Yeah, it's kind of dovetailed nicely that we're talking about, this particular argument. And really, though, it doesn't matter if it comes from Huff or not, because this kind of argument is being proffered by various apologists, including people like Titus Kennedy, who has, I believe, a terminal degree in archaeology.
Kennedy has a PhD. He's an archaeologist.
Yeah.
David Roll has a PhD. He's an Egyptologist.
Yeah.
Huff, I assume we'll get his PhD.
Yeah, I don't have any doubt. I mean, I've seen other things that Huff has produced, and a lot of them I end up agreeing with him. It just on these particular issues, especially something I'm interested, like the Gospel of Mark. I just you know that he's either not reading it. Well, he's not reading it the way I do, which may be more my problem than his. I don't know. But let's move on, because, like I said, we're going to put up some slides that you've created, and I'm going to let you, of course, take control there, where you have addressed Huff in particular. Now, just so everyone knows, if you're watching this, the blog post that Pat wrote deals with more of what Titus Kennedy says about the issue, and there's links in that post to the piece that Kennedy wrote. This deals with Huff. Was it Instagram that he put these images up? Is that where it came from?
It's both on Instagram and also on his blog.
Okay.
I grabbed these images from Instagram. People can find this fairly easily online.
Yeah. Well, I'll try to make sure there's links to things in the show notes.
Perfect.
So that people can just quickly check our work. I'm a big, chase the footnotes kind of guy. So, and I got that from Nat Redemeyer, who is he's a Christian who's written extensively at his website, biblicalhistoricalcontext.com. He's written a lot about the Exodus event. Fantastic
Good stuff. Yeah.
He is a brilliant guy, nice guy, just amazing. So if you've not checked out his website, you definitely should. So, Pat, why don't you guide us through your slides? And I don't have any more prepared questions about this. I think it would just be fun to kind of go back and forth, especially with Mark's knowledge of this subject and your knowledge. It should be a very, very good conversation.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. And if I misstate anything or if I assume some knowledge or facts that are not in evidence, please feel free to stop me. I'm hoping you guys can advocate for the viewers.
Absolutely.
Make this as easy for them to understand. There will be a fair amount of detail during the discussion here, but it's actually a pretty simple argument here. Once we get into it. And I'll point out how simple it is once we hit that spot. A couple of other prefaces very quickly. One thing that we're not going to do is harp on all of the minor typos and grammatical issues with the slides. This was not an academic paper. This was an Instagram post.
Exactly.
So I hope folks don't feel, don't scream at us in the comments that we missed these misspellings or grammatical issues. We saw them. They're just not that big a deal.
Yeah, we're focusing on
that's not important at all.
Yeah,
exactly.
No. Now, it pains me to say that because I am a pedantic, petty, insufferable little man. So I would love to point out every little error, but it's just...
I do it with my own stuff all the time.
Yeah. I actually had a girlfriend in college not write me letters because she was worried I was creating... least that's the reason she told me. So that's one thing. The other thing I just want to make clear, I don't take the position that there were no Hebrews or Israelites, or actually I would say Proto-Israelites, under Egyptian domination during the Late Bronze Age and into the Early Iron Age. I think there were Northwest Semitic peoples who would eventually become Hebrews or Israelites, Judahites, whatever you want to call them. But I wouldn't say, I'm not taking the position there were none of these people ever suffered under Egyptian subjugation. I think they did. I just don't think the timing works out here for what Huff's argument.
Yeah.
I'm also not saying I'm probably Mark a little bit more like those minimalists who are inclined to. I don't know if I'd call myself a minimalist, but I do think something happened, just not as described in the Bible.
Yeah.
And so
I think all three of us are probably minimalists in that sense.
Yeah.
You know, something happened. What it was can't be for sure. So
Right.
All right. So I will say Huff's opening slide here lays out, I mean, this is his thesis. This papyrus, the Brooklyn Papyrus 35, 1446, proves Hebrew slaves were in Egypt. Okay. And my argument, there's a term we learn in law school is nuh-uh. So it's actually not that much more complicated. We'll get to, of course, I also can't say anything in 10 words when 100 will do. So
yeah.
We're gonna have to listen to the
I think
version.
It's also, just as a quick point, really important to note that we need to be very careful about not using words like prove. That what the most we can do is offer evidence in favor of a point, and then viewers, listeners, readers can determine if they find that evidence convincing enough in favor of that point.
Absolutely.
None of this is proof of anything, one way or the other.
Fair enough. All right. And I'm also not going to cover every single slide that Huff, in the interest of time, and also because some weren't, I thought, terribly relevant to his argument. Like, he had a nice slide about Egyptian hieratics. This papyrus was written in hieratic, Egyptian hieratics.
Okay.
That really doesn't have anything to do with the content. That's just the writing system that was used. So there are just some things we're going to gloss over here. So I hope no one thinks I'm, getting cute or being fishy. I just didn't see it was particularly relevant to the crux of the matter here.
Yeah.
So this first slide that we're looking at is Huff's setting the scene, telling us when the papyrus was composed. He gives us the date range of 1809 to 1743 BCE, which is what the Brooklyn Museum publishes. It's pretty standard dating for this papyrus. He dates this to the reign of Amenemhat III, which we'll come back to. That I'm not so keen on. I would agree that this date range more or less aligns with the period associated with the patriarchs. I'm sure Huff and the three of us would not agree very much on the historicity of the narratives associated with the patriarchs, but the time period depicted is about right. I actually think that this would be a little early if you look at how the Hebrew experience in Egypt is described, and it's frankly 400 years pressed into 2 or 3 sentences in Exodus 1. The impression you get is that they don't actually become forced to do labor until they are numerous enough to pose a threat to Egyptian authority. So the sense you get is that for the first 100-200 years of the ostensibly 4 or so century sojourn, they're just doing fine. They're thriving. They're spreading throughout the land and so on. So to some extent, this papyrus would not match that particular version or interpretation of Exodus 1. I'm not too hung up on it. This is close enough. So I think that the dating is about right, and putting it in the time of the patriarchs, I don't really have an objection to that. I have to mention the Merneptah stela, both because I really like it, and I wouldn't have included it. So
it's cool. It's pretty cool.
It's an odd image in this context. So the Merneptah stela is a stela put up by Merneptah, who's a pharaoh, followed Ramses II. I think he might have been the first one right after Ramses. Might have been Seti. Anyways, late 13th century pharaoh. Recorded deeds on the stela, and it includes the earliest extant attestation to a people group known as Israel. So it's our oldest firm, tangible anchor when discussing the history of ancient Israel.
Yeah, not just outside the Bible, but before the Bible.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I know the three of us know this, but maybe not all of the viewers might realize this. Our oldest biblical texts are fragmentary copies from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you're looking at 300, 200 BCE at the earliest. So there is a huge gap in the documentary record between the time period we're talking about and our oldest extant copies. Now, I'm not saying that everything was written in the 300s or 200s. That's just the oldest stuff that we can get our hands on.
Yeah.
So it's an incredibly important artifact. It looks cool. I mean, I'd throw it in things maybe if I had a reason to. On the other hand, this is 500 or 600 years after the time period of the papyrus that we're discussing. So it's like, writing a biography of Shakespeare, but then throwing in a photo of Anthony Hopkins for some reason. All right. So speaking of my high functioning OCD, so the reference to Amenemhat III, I'm not a fan of this. I would dock point. So if we read the sentence, the papyrus is produced during the reign of Amenemhat III, making its production somewhere between 1809 and 1743 BCE. This, I don't know that he meant to write the sentence this way, but this really conveys the sense that Amenemhat III reigned from 1809 to 1743 BC, and he didn't.
Right.
He didn't. The chronologies are kind of all, chronologies are tricky in antiquity, and they're trickier the further back you go. But I couldn't find any chronology that put Amenemhat III's reign all the way up to 1743.
Yeah, well, that's a long reign. That's 70 years. What is that?
It's 65 years, give or take.
Yeah, almost 70
something
years.
Like
so that. I can't think of very many pharaohs who ever reigned that long. So yeah, it does seem problematic.
Yeah, it's not impossible. Actually, Ramses II, I think it was about this length. In fact, it might have been 66.
Yeah, he reigned. So yeah.
So it's not impossible, but it would be unusual. You're right. But we know Amenemhat III did not reign all the way up until 1743. His reign probably ended 1810, 1800, 1890ish, somewhere in there, give or take. And we also know that, after he was towards the end of the 12th dynasty, the 13th dynasty was a period of pretty significant comparative pharaonic instability. That might be an unfair way to put it, but they burned through pharaohs kind of like Spinal Tap went through drummers during this time period. So, if you look at the histories here of the early 13th dynasty, half a dozen pharaohs fit in this time period, maybe more. So to say this papyrus was written during the reign of one guy and to imply pretty strongly, again, maybe inadvertently, that these were the dates of the guy's reign, it's just not accurate.
Yeah.
The other thing is that even though some of the content might go back to Amenemhat III, this papyrus was worked on over a period of decades, it appears. And the section we're talking about, the list of slaves, was definitely something that came up in the 13th dynasty, 1, 2, 3 decades in. So just to say that this papyrus was written during the reign of Amenemhat III is, at best imprecise, at worst just wrong.
Yeah.
And he didn't have to, I think here he was trying to create that sense of historicity, of legitimacy by citing a particular pharaoh. You didn't have to, and just leave the pharaoh out, because it could have been, this section could have been written during, one of any, 10 different pharaohs possibly.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
could he have been choosing a specific pharaoh's name because the Book of Exodus doesn't name what pharaohs are involved? Like he's trying to give a narrative for his readers.
Yeah, framework by which you can read the Exodus narrative into Egyptian history.
Yeah.
It's possible. I'm not sure he thought about it in those terms. I think what happened is that's the other thing, is because it's an Instagram post, we don't know what his sources are.
Sure.
Okay. And by the way, I'm not expecting him to provide his sources. I'm just saying we don't have them, so we don't know where he found this stuff.
It's hard to tell.
My guess is he saw, Kenneth Kitchens, when he wrote up, I think he wrote a review of Hayes' book, And he talks about how some of the content goes back to Amenemhat III. So I'm guessing Huff was just in a rush.
Okay.
That's just my guess, and didn't really parse through everything.
Well, and again, in Huff's defense, also, he's a New Testament guy.
Yeah.
And so I know if I started to try to wax elephant about the Hebrew Bible and any kind of history connected to it, I would make mistake after mistake after mistake. It's why I don't usually talk about it, because I'm just not good at it. Not to say Huff's not good at it, but just, he's a New Testament guy, and so
if he has content he's more familiar with.
Yeah. And of course, Mark and I would agree that on that subject he's also wrong, but that's a topic for another time. Don't want to open that can of worms.
And on the one hand, I agree with what you're saying and your kind of willingness to, and this is not a big deal. I mean, if this slide were the only problem in the presentation, we wouldn't be talking.
Yeah.
But if you're holding yourself out as an authority on something like this,
yes,
and nowhere in this presentation does he say, hey, this is kind of what I'm finding. I'm not an expert in this field. He's making categorical declarations here.
Well, as Mark pointed out, he's saying it's proof.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, that was my big problem with that video I watched, that he was so assertive with his claims.
Yeah.
And by the time he gets to the end of it, he's literally backtracking on the whole premise of the video, which is to provide proof chapter by chapter through the entire book of Bark. And then he stops maybe a little over halfway through. It's like, why put in the effort if you're not going to do it right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be super detailed, super in-depth, technical, overwhelming your viewers and listeners just to show how much you know. But if you're not going to put in the effort, why do it?
Yeah. And this slide, again, not to harp too much on this slide, because this is a venial sin slide,
Sure.
But if you're gonna, he chose to add a pharaoh's name.
Yeah.
He didn't have to. And if you're going to do that, I think it behooves you to get the chronological information. I mean, history is a lot more than just chronology, but good chronology is the backbone of good history. And if you can't get the background information right, it does create a bit of a credibility problem.
Yeah, it's an unforced error, to use a baseball term. It's just, you didn't have to make the mistake, but you did. So it's just do better, right?
Yeah. So again, not a big deal. This doesn't crush Huff's argument, and it doesn't matter. I mean, does this papyrus contain Hebrew names of Hebrew slaves, or doesn't it? Who the pharaoh was when that was written, strictly logically speaking, it's not really relevant.
So he's got the dating essentially correct.
Yeah.
Whatever the pharaoh was. So the key thing here is this is the dating. So what's the significance here?
Yeah. No, why he's got the pharaoh there, I think he's just trying to add some color.
Yeah.
To fill in some context. And
so let's move on to your next slide, because I think we should probably start digging into the papyrus itself, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is a two-sided papyrus, right? There's the purported Hebrew names appear on the reverse side of the papyrus. And you just said that the evidence suggests that this is a document that was written over time, not just in one sitting, but over maybe some decades.
Yes.
Okay.
So the material on the back, on the verso, appears to be newer, than some of the material on the front. So it gets kind of complicated. But the list of servants, so it's on the verso, it's on the back side.
Mm-hmm.
It's 95 servants, purported to belong to an Egyptian noblewoman named Senebtisi. And we can kind of date things there because she was the widow of a vizier, who's the dead son of a previous vizier of the 13th dynasty, a guy named Anku, who's a pretty prominent, well-known vizier of the 13th dynasty.
Okay.
So, the names of the servants are all on the back side. And let's actually go ahead and move to the next slide where Huff gets into this.
Yeah.
This is where the rubber meets the road. Okay.
Yeah, you can see, like you were saying before, how fragmentary it is. So that's a really good visualization of the papyrus there.
Yeah, and this is just one chunk of it. Yeah, anyone can go to the Brooklyn Museum website and see the full thing. In fact, I don't think they have it on display physically in the galleries right now.
Really?
So that might be your best way of getting a sense for how this thing looks.
Okay.
The Brooklyn Museum website. Okay, so this slide is where it all comes together or falls apart, I guess. So how is this slide like making out with your sister in an elevator? It's wrong on multiple levels. Sorry, I'm the son of.
That's a horrible joke that I will definitely use in the future.
I was going to say you can edit that out if you want. That's, I'm a upper Midwesterner, so that's as dirty as it gets for us.
Oh, not too blue there,
huh? So this slide is where the argument is made, such as it is. And I'd like to start the critique with kind of working our way up from the bottom of Huff's slide. So by starting at the image, we're starting with the image. So the image, I think it's fair to interpret, is stating, not in sentence form, but in visual form, that this papyrus contains the 4 names Shiphrah, Issachar, Asher, and Jacob. So the question is, and I'm not too hung up on the rectangles. I'm not sure they're in the right spot, but it's not a big deal. They may be, and they may not. I'm not worried about that.
I can't read hieratic, so who knows?
Yeah. So the question is, does this papyrus contain these 4 names? And if I had to answer with a binary yes or no, I would have to honestly answer no. It does not.
Okay.
So let's walk through them very quickly. Shiphrah, sure. Full points for Shiphrah. I'm not going to object to that. Issachar, Asher, and Jacob are not in the papyrus. Feminine forms of these names are in the papyrus. So Issachar, Asher, and Jacob are here because those are names from the Bible.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I don't know if Huff realizes that they're feminine names, because there's nothing in this presentation to indicate that he knows that. If he knew it, then he's cutting corners and just not showing his work.
Yeah.
How he gets from the feminine forms to say, oh, it's pretty much like the Hebrew male names we see later on.
It'd be like taking the name Joanna and saying it's John.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not fabricating things out of whole cloth, but if you introduced your friend Joanna as John, she might have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So that's not accurate. And I will say, it's close-ish. It's not egregiously wrong in the sense that, names like these are in this papyrus. But if I were editing these slides, for a poster or an article or a textbook, I would send this back and I would say no.
Yeah.
Put the right names in there, or add a footnote, or use 2 slides, do something. But you're misrepresenting what the papyrus contains with this image.
It needs to be nuanced. Yeah.
Again, whether it's Huff's doing or his source, I have no idea.
Well, jog my memory. When Kennedy wrote about this in that post, does he claim that they are these masculine version of the names, or does he present them as such, or does he add the nuance that they are feminine forms of these Semitic names?
No, Kennedy shows his work. He says that these are feminine forms. He explains why. It's listed mostly household servants, and household servants tended to be female. The servants who worked in the fields or the mines tended to be guys.
And real quick, though, just something that bothers me. Kennedy, like, over and again refers to these people as servants. And I'm glad that Huff takes the time to call them slaves, because this is what they were.
Yeah.
Like, and I just, we live in a time where enslaved people are increasingly, we try to gloss over them. And I just appreciate, for what it's worth, Huff updating the language to make sure we realize these people were not volunteering their services. These were enslaved people by a relatively ruthless empire in the ancient Near East. So that's just my little soapbox. So I apologize for that.
I actually find it surprising that, especially coming from the apologetic side, anybody would water that term down from slave down to servant, when they're trying to establish the historicity of the Exodus narrative, where it's about them being enslaved.
Yeah. That it is a funny way they because it's you'll see online arguments about whether there's slavery in the Hebrew Bible. Dr. Joshua Bowen, who's written a book on this subject, and they'll be like, well, it's not slavery they're talking about. Well, what do you do with when the Bible calls Egypt the house of slavery? Like, it's not the house of servants. Like, they weren't escaping, being paid laborers. They were escaping slavery. There's definitely an inconsistency there. So, I don't get it. But in any event, so these are the names of slaves.
Yeah.
But they are feminine names, not masculine names, for the most part, that are being highlighted here.
Right.
Okay.
So, and he's kind of skipping the step and pulling in these recognizably biblical Hebrew names.
Okay.
Again, cutting some corners here. And for the record, I do want to point out that the person misgendering folks here is the evangelical apologist, and not the liberal critics. So. Yeah. One of life's little fun.
You get some points for that.
Thank you. So
yeah, that caught me off guard.
On that note, let's move up to the text if that's okay. All right. So the first sentence, no major problems with that. The papyrus has 80 lines of text recording 95 names of slaves and laborers and so on. There's more context to it, but it's not really relevant.
Yeah.
Then we get to the sentence, and there are kind of 3, maybe 4 things to get into here. So, so 30 of the 80 names, I think he meant to say 95 names. His eyes just tracked up and saw 80 up there. So that I can totally see myself doing that. So I will
absolutely,
not,
me too.
Huff, fist bump Huff for doing something I would do. And I should say it's probably 30 to 45. There's some uncertainty about some of the names. So folks who look into this will find different figures, but it's roughly 3 dozen or a third of the names. Not too hung up on that. So 30 of these names are Semitic names. I'm going to drop Hebrew for the moment. That's true. About a third, 3 dozen of these names or so, give or take, are recognizably linguistically Semitic. So they're not Egyptian names. Now I should be a little bit careful. Sometimes they're paired with Egyptian names. You'll see somebody who has, an Egyptian and a Semitic name.
Okay.
Because people used to get renamed. That happens in situations of forced servitude or slavery.
Yeah.
But we about 30 to 45 of the names are Semitic, recognizably linguistically Semitic. The Hebrew part is a problem. So for
he kind of throws that in there. It's not just Semitic names. He's saying it's Semitic Hebrew.
Yeah, and I haven't read anybody aside from Huff claiming that all of the Semitic names are Hebrew. I mean, that's what he's saying here.
So not even Canonita doesn't argue that either.
And up to 10 are Hebrew.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and Albright and Kitchens and Hoffmeyer all recognize that roughly 10-ish, give or take. I don't know if they all put numbers on it, but are look Hebrew, or resemble Hebrew names, or are linguistically related to Hebrew names, which I would agree with. But to say that all 30 of them are not only Semitic, but all of the Semitic names are Hebrew names, I think, if Huff actually has an argument for this, I'd love to see it.
Yeah.
But it's a novel argument, and I mean, frankly, I just think he just was in a rush and didn't just sort of. I shouldn't speculate as to how he got here, I guess. But that's kind of problematic. Some of the names are Semitic and just don't resemble Hebrew names.
Okay.
Finally, so here's the main thing: are any of the names identifiably, specifically, distinctively Hebrew, as opposed to Semitic names generally? Okay, and this is so here's the point, folks. No, the names look like Hebrew names, but they're not and cannot be distinctively, specifically, linguistically Hebrew. Okay, there were names used by Hebrews eventually, but at the time in the 1700s, 1800s, you can't point to these names and say, "Oh, this is somebody who worships the God of Abraham. I can tell that from this name, and therefore they're a Hebrew."
Okay.
So a little bit of background. I'm pushing the wrong button on my laptop. So awkward pause while I find the right button. So let's take a step back here and cover a little of the information that we discussed in the blog post from I think March 2024.
Yeah.
And I'm recycling a family tree of languages that
I think I've seen this graphic before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are a ton of versions of it out there. And I love these things on the one hand because they do a pretty good job of showing that the chief relationships are between these families.
Mhm.
On the other hand, they do give you the misleading impression that once these languages split, they don't ever talk to each other again, and that's just not
Yeah.
the case.
This very linear evolution, which is not how language works.
Right, exactly. So,
Yep.
Caveat lector. These are great for showing relationships, but we know for a fact Akkadian influenced all of the languages over in West Semitic. I shouldn't say that, but a lot of the
Akkadian
languages.
was the lingua franca for a long time in that region, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So Akkadian, affected Aramaic, which affected Hebrew. Akkadian also affected Hebrew directly. It's much messier than this graphic shows. But it's a useful tool for just classifying taxonomically languages. So it's important for folks to realize, if they don't already know about this, that Hebrew is not the only, and it wasn't the first, and it was never even the most widely spoken Semitic language in antiquity. Okay, it's very closely related to a lot of its sibling and parent or uncle aunt languages in the Northwest Semitic family. So it has a lot of similar terms, a lot of similar grammatical elements. The morphology of the language tracks very closely with some of the other languages that are close to it. I mean, early on, so Hebrew probably started separating or evolving from Canaanite roughly around 1200 BCE. And I say roughly, very roughly.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's
I should
a period
point out,
of history that we just don't have a lot of information about the Levant.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the records are not what we would like them to be. And, even the records that were generated, if they were on papyrus, unless they ended up in Egypt, they just tended to rot away pretty quickly. So, so Hebrew probably started to develop as a dialect of Canaanite around 1200 BCE. I do want to emphasize this is not some wild-eyed liberal, minimalist, secular approach. This is bog standard historical Semitic linguistics. In fact, 1200 might be a little conservative. There are some people who would say we shouldn't start talking about a Hebrew language until the monarchy, really.
Yeah, about 1000. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm willing to push it back for the sake of discussion. And for a century, 2 or 3, Hebrew and Phoenician and Moabite and other close languages were probably mutually intelligible and didn't become separate languages where people would have a hard time understanding each other until into the first millennium.
Well, real quick, I think you might go into this later in a later slide, but I know that Egypt had some control over Canaan for quite a while. In fact, we have the Amarna letters, which are correspondences, right, between the Egyptian government and officials in the Levant. Are those, none of those are Canaanite, right? Are those all in Egypt? I can't remember.
No, so those are, so, well, writ large, the Amarna letters are from a bunch of different locations throughout the ancient Near East to Egypt, but they include a big chunk of them.
Jerusalem and
are from Canaan. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and they're written in, it's Akkadian, but it's a Canaanite flavored form of Akkadian.
Okay.
So I guess that's how I put it. And I'm not an expert on the Amarna letters, but I know the writing system is a version of Akkadian, but there are certain characteristics of the Akkadian that are unique to.
Yeah. And that just goes, it's further evidence, as you've already mentioned, that Hebrew is not this universal language that some conservatives would have had, would have you think it is. There's the real language you control is Akkadian. You have all these dialects, these other languages that are related, but Hebrew is just this one small sliver in a vast, array of languages that are being used in the region. And it's not even until, 1200 or a little bit later that it's even being used at all.
Yeah. And so to really make it clear to folks, I hope I'm not shattering any expectations, but, Adam and Eve didn't speak Hebrew. Noah didn't speak Hebrew. Abraham didn't speak Hebrew. If anything, Abraham probably spoke Akkadian.
Yeah.
There's a story with Jacob in the book of Genesis where it talks about, I think it's Jacob and Laban.
Yes.
Whatever his relative's name is, where
his father-in-law.
They're referring to a certain location and they The text specifies they had different names for it in their respective languages. It's like this is his family member, like just 2 degrees removed from himself, speaking a whole other dialect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah,
that's a really good point. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, no, that is the only thing I know about it is it wasn't Hebrew. So too early for Hebrew. So so to get back to off slide and the critique of it. So remember the papyrus that we're talking about was written probably, and certainly the section we're focusing on, the list of slaves, was written in the 1700s. So 500, 600, 700 years before there was a Hebrew language. I did see somebody wrote a comment when the piece published on your website did get a little bit of. Of course, I went out and Googled the article to see if it was talked about on Reddit and whatnot. And at some point, somebody talked about it, the argument that I made and said, well, just because there wasn't a Hebrew language doesn't mean there weren't Hebrew names. That's exactly what it means. You can't have Hebrew names, just to be clear, without a Hebrew language. It's Hebrew names are Hebrew words and phrases and even sentences. You can't have identifiably distinctive, uniquely Hebrew names if you don't have that identifiable, distinctive, uniquely Hebrew language.
Exactly. Yeah.
So just maybe it didn't need saying, but I went ahead and said it because I thought that comment was kind of adorable. So it's just not possible. Just chronologically not possible for these names to be Hebrew. Okay. So we're going to just go through a few things, not just sort of teeing off of the slides, off of Huff's slides, but maybe not focusing too much on that slide anymore. So the names that are in the papyrus that appear to be Hebrew, and I get why they look Hebrew. They look like names you see in the Hebrew Bible, names of Hebrew characters. And, if you didn't know anything about the time period in linguistics, I would find this a very compelling argument. But once you find out some things about the linguistics in the time period, the argument doesn't work very well. So all of the names, so there's the 4 names that Huff mentioned on that slide. I've summarized here very quickly. These all come from common West Semitic or Northwest Semitic roots. That's how you form names back in the day. You took a Hebrew root, a Hebrew word, and you maybe changed the vowels, added a prefix or suffix, and you got a name. Or you could add a couple of words together to get a name as well. None of the names that Huff highlighted are uniquely or distinctively Hebrew. They all come from roots that form names that work in all kinds of Northwest or West Semitic languages. So Shifra, we know that, and I use the Hebrew letters because PowerPoint, believe it or not, doesn't accept, Proto-Sinaitic or Phoenician characters. So I had to use the modern Hebrew text there. But Shifra just comes, from Shin Peiresh. It's just a word meaning beautiful. This works well in Arabic and Aramaic and other languages. Same thing with Issachar, Asher. Jacob is well. I kind of want to talk about this a little bit. So variants of Jacob are just all over the place in the ancient Near East among Semitic-speaking peoples. We see some variants of it. They're in the Mari texts, which are written in Akkadian. I think the languages, though, the names are either Amorite or Aramaic. I can't remember which. And it's tough because it's actually written in Akkadian, so sometimes you have a hard time.
Okay.
But they're definitely not Hebrew names. But there are a couple of different versions of Yaakov El, so Jacob El. And notwithstanding the folk etymology in the Hebrew Bible, Jacob means protected by. It doesn't mean one who follows or grabs the heel of his brother, or the
supplanter.
Yeah. Who's gonna
wait? So is the Yah part of that not theophoric? Is it not a reference to Yahweh?
Not in Jacob, no.
Okay.
It's from a root that means to protect.
Okay.
Or to guard or to watch.
Yeah.
And so Yaakov El, in fact, our Jacob, the Hebrew Jacob, from in Genesis, there's a good argument that that's actually an abbreviated form, and that it used to say Yaakov El. And his name changes to
Israel. Yeah.
Israel.
So anyway, that's a little speculative and off topic. But
interesting.
We have Jacob's, up in the Mari text, not a Hebrew context. We have a Jacob who was a pharaoh. Yaakov Har was an Egyptian pharaoh during the 15th or Hyksos dynasty. So the Hyksos dynasty was a series of pharaohs from the mid 1600s to the mid 1500s, give or take. This is all, please don't try to pin me down on specific dates with these chronologies. But it was a series of pharaohs whose cultural background was Canaanite. They came from a population of, the Egyptians called them Asiatics, Amu, Asiatics, and so these were basically Canaanite folks, southern Levantine, who had migrated to, or maybe in some cases were forcibly taken to, the Nile Delta, and formed a community there. And they became so powerful that for 100 years there were Hyksos, Canaanite / West Semitic pharaohs, one of whom was named Jacob, Yaqub Har, protected by the mountain. That's probably a good translation of it. There might be others. So if you're going to take the Huff-Kennedy role position and say, oh, well, Jacob is a Hebrew name, therefore people with the name Jacob must have been Hebrews, I'd love to hear the story of how there was a Hebrew pharaoh right in the middle of the Egyptian captivity, and no one thought to mention that in the Pentateuch.
Yeah.
It's just, and no one thinks this. No one thinks there were Hebrew pharaohs, because there weren't. These guys were all, polytheistic Canaanite pharaohs. They worship both Canaanite and Egyptian gods.
Oh, I wouldn't say no one, because I have come across the argument that specifically
there's always somebody.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, Jacob, Joseph were part of some kind of pharaonic dynasty, however briefly lived before the Exodus, as if the Bible is giving us not 100% history, but it's definitely pointing to something that actually happened. So I've come across it before. I think Bernard Lamberel, I don't know if you know Bernard, I've interviewed him before. He wrote a book called The Covenant, and his thesis is that Abraham did not make a covenant with some deity. He made a covenant with the very real human king Hammurabi, and that he can tease out the details from this. It's a fascinating. I don't agree with it. I do not buy it. There's many problems I have with it. I wrote a book review about it, but he points out some really interesting things that make you go, "Well, that's." I can see why you might think that. And I think he has an appendix in that book where he talks about the Hyksos and the possibility that Jacob may have been a pharaoh. Like I may be misrepresenting it, but I'm pretty sure he talks about that. But that's The Covenant by Bernard Lamberel, if anybody's interested. So
yeah, and you're right. I shouldn't have said nobody, because I know Josephus, in fact, does try to align
that's right.
the experience of the Hyksos with the Hebrews.
Yeah,
I should say maybe something like no mainstream modern scholar.
Yeah, definitely not consensus. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I would say, go ahead.
Well, no, actually, keep going. Okay.
I was going to say there is something to the idea of, Northwest Semitic, again, Canaanite, Asiatic, whatever adjective you want to use, officials serving in pretty senior roles in pharaonic courts. So there is good evidence for that. It's just, having Hebrew Israelite pharaohs is something that the historical record, again, at least according to the mainstream consensus, just does not support.